Hey guys, so we've had a couple weekends worth of high-level Yu-Gi-Oh events since the ban list came into effect, so as usual I wanted to take the time to map out some of the most played hand traps and staples among the topping lists from these events, this time focusing on German and French nationals. And so before I continue, big thanks to my sponsors, links and discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh supplies below. Now, speaking of Yu-Gi-Oh supplies, Dragon Shield is doing this really amazing giveaway, so definitely make sure to check this out. I'll put the link down in the description below, and I'm sure you've seen this with some of the other content creators already, but keep in mind these are actually all separate giveaways, so the more you enter, the more chances you have to win, so a big thanks to Dragon Shield for their generosity. I also wanted to shout out some of these amazing Yu-Gi-Oh resources that you should definitely follow and check out in terms of, topping results, and that's the Card Launcher Store, as well as Ready for Duel, and also YGO Pro Deck. And there's also other individuals who are compiling spreadsheets, for example, for these regional tops as well, such as TSP YGO, Lampy YGO, as well as Ivan, so I'll certainly link all of those down below as well. And so in terms of the deck lists that were included for this video, of course, I'm sort of basing on whatever was publicly available, and I also decided to just focus on German and French nationals. I know there were a lot of regional events the last couple of weekends as well, but I sort of figured, that's way too many deck lists for me to have to go through individually, but also, these events are really high level, and they also had a pretty big sample size as well, so we managed to find 41 deck lists. This is sort of how the pie chart looked like. It's obviously not perfect. If we had all of the deck lists available, the pie chart probably slightly would have looked different. For example, I'm seeing that there's not much Labrynth here in terms of what's included, but we do have Kashtira and Spright, which are right now probably the most played decks anyways. So in terms of an overview of the hand trap data, so median was 6, so this is actually quite the nosedive from the 11 we saw when I did this last month, but that makes sense, right? Because last month was when Super Heavy Samurai and Pearly were of course tier 1, and in particular for Super Heavy Samurai, not only did they play a lot of hand traps, it was also because they kind of had no choice, because they can't really play your traditional spell traps, and also because of the type of board that they make, it also forced other decks to play a lot of hand traps as well, which really skyrocketed that median count. I mean, 11 hand traps in the median is actually quite high historically speaking from the years that I've been doing these analysis. But in terms of the side, it went slightly higher than last time. It was around 4 last month, I believe, and now it's 5. And so I guess it got a little bit more delegated to the side, but overall pretty similar historically. Now in terms of going second board breakers, this certainly did bump up a little bit. It was around 3 I believe in the main last month, but now median of 5, so definitely a shift towards more board breakers and hand traps this month compared to last month. Now typically I do find even within the same format, this kind of flips back and forth sometimes. In one YCS there might be a lot of hand traps played, and the next YCS there might be a lot less, and everyone just focused on board breakers, and so it kind of flips back and forth. It's definitely has a trend in that regard. In terms of the side, it was 6 board breakers in the side, which has actually been quite similar compared to last month, as well as the few formats prior to that as well. So if we cover some of the most played hand traps as usual, let's cover the top 10, and Ash is back to number 1. Last format was actually Droll, which again, probably not surprising because Super Heavy Samurai was just insane, and you really needed the Droll to be able to stop them from preventing to make a board, because once they make that board, it was kind of impossible to win. And another hand trap that you're not going to really see here anymore is of course Gamma, because of that limit. But anyways, Ash very strong against certain matchups, let's say like Branded and Labrynth. Those are the really obvious ones. Against Spright, of course, hitting or preventing Gigantic's kind of nice, but at the same time I do find when we're in a format where Talents is very popular, which you will see later in this video, Ash can be kind of a little problematic too, because if it's again in a matchup where it's not that amazing and you Ash them and now they Talents you and rip another card out of your hand, you do kind of get punished. So I do think that it's great against certain matchups, but against some other ones, it's a little questionable and has usually been considered as low impact. And then we have Imperm, which for the most part is always reliably high. Even in that tier format, this was at least one of the more traditional hand traps that still saw play. The only time where I think I saw Imperm where it kind of sort of completely disappeared in play was during that format where, for example, Virtual World was tier 1 with VFD, and also Eldritch was in that format at the same time, so which, Imperm was not that great against. But at the same time, even now, it is pretty strong, right? Of course, against, there's a lot of Spright now, and that this is always strong. Again, plays around Talents, which is a nice bonus. Even against Branded, it's kind of funny a lot of times where, maybe I shouldn't say a lot, but there's definitely a handful of times where, the Branded player is going to pass on a little bit just because that Imperm was actually that deadly. Of course, if they have lost, then it just becomes a completely different situation if they also have Branded Fusion on top of that. Against Labrynth, obviously not great either. And against Vanquish Soul, another new meta contender now, it's not amazing just because they can tag out if you were to try to hit their main deck monsters, which we really shouldn't bother. Against the Link on your turn can be at least relevant. And then we have Bestials and a Rise of Bestials again. So this picture is Magma Nut, but I'm kind of representing all the Bestials. For the most part, it's, Druid's Worm and Magma go hand in hand. Serenir, while not as played as much, it's more so kind of like a main deck engine piece for Branded, so I didn't really want to include that anyways. And Bestials, it's still, while it's not tier limit format anymore, it still has some pretty strong applicability. Against Branded, it's honestly devastating against them if you have this. Really strong. Against Labrynth too, it can really mess up their, timing in terms of the Labrynth monster being able to set, for example. So it's definitely strong. Obviously, Math Mech has declined and play a little bit, so maybe it's not as relevant in that regard, but definitely certainly really strong. And Dragon Link is kind of popular again, and they are obviously playing this as not only disruption but just like their main deck engine kind of card. And then we have Ghost Spell, which was side deck more so if it was played at all. Personally, I was actually a little surprised it was played this much. Perhaps I'm in the wrong. I mean, of course it has applicability against Labrynth, preventing their Labrynth monsters from coming out. Can have use against Branded as well. Can sometimes be really good in terms of stopping that Sanctifier gimmick lock, for example, which can really single-handedly help you win, because otherwise you would have just straight up lost. But against Branded, it can also get a little iffy, because if you, for example, ended up like holding on to it, and then you just kind of let them do their whole thing in their turn, you can get punished, because if they have like lost setup now and they use Branded Red, they, let's say, special whatever fusion monster, and then on that, they go lost and then change Sanctifier, get that gimmick lock, then you just cannot respond at that point, and you also could not bell a Branded Red while they have Branded lost up, right? So it can be a little iffy sometimes too. Against, I guess, Runick variants, you can technically stop like the draw effect, but it kind of feels bad when you're only doing that, stopping that once. But you know what, while not as generic as Ash, it can actually surprisingly hit a lot of different decks, so I guess I can understand it. And then we have Shifter. This is definitely a card that I wish Konami had done something about now that they got rid of Gamma, at least to 1. And Master Duel, I think they put this at 2, or maybe it's OCG or both. So it's certainly a really toxic card, and a deck like Kashtira, Fluanderies can make use of it very, very well, and a lot of decks can really struggle against this card. And it's not just Kashtira that was playing Shifter. Even something, Spright typically in tier format had actually sided this. While it cannot play optimally as Kashtira or Fluanderies can, for example, it can still like survive under Shifter. And I even saw a Branded list side deck this card, which is kind of funny because Shifter does hurt Branded in terms of grind game because everything is getting banished, but at the same time it doesn't necessarily die to it and can sort of play within the realms. So when you're going against a deck that completely dies to Shifter, I guess I can kind of understand why even a Branded list decided to side it. And then we have Droll, which of course was the #1 most played hand trap last month when Super Heavy Samurai, Pearly were like the top decks. Now I think it's still actually pretty good though. Against Kashtira, like Fluanderies, obviously if they have Shifter, then it really sucks because you cannot use Droll anymore. But if they didn't have Shifter, Droll is actually quite good against them. And so against something like Runick, with a lot of those variants coming back, Droll is obviously very, very strong. Against Branded, it's for the most part not that great, and obviously against Labrynth, it's not great either. So I can kind of see why it's declined a lot in play, but I don't think you should sort of underestimate it and not play around Droll. I think it's still worthy of consideration. And then we have Nib. I actually thought this would be played a little bit more, because every time I think that it wouldn't be played that much, it ends up being played quite a lot. So it's always like the opposite of what I think it is. So clearly I'm not the best for this. But you know what? I think it still has applicability. Like against Kashtira, it can still come up. Obviously against Labrynth, it's not going to come up at all. Against Spright, for the most part, they are going to be able to resolve like Gigantic, or at least have a red negate setup. But if sometimes they honestly cannot have it that way, and they get heavily punished. Against Branded, for the most part, it's really not that great. They can kind of still set things up, but it can potentially prevent like a gimmick lock from happening too in certain situations. So you know what, the applicability is still there, and I'm sure regardless of whenever people think it's bad for the format, it usually ends up coming back here nonetheless. And then the rest were not played that much, and it kind of tanked in terms of representation. Valor, obviously, similar to Imperm, but again, in a format where Talents is played a lot, this kind of plays into that a lot. Ghost Ogre is kind of weird. I mean, against Kashtira, Fluanderies, it's like good, of course. Against a lot of other strategies, can kind of not be amazing. Against Branded, it's funny because it used to be really bad against Branded, but nowadays, actually, hitting the Cartesia can actually make plays really awkward for the Branded player, not gonna lie. And then Ghost Mourner is pretty much similar to like Valor. Imperm, it has a little bit different applicability. It's also a win, which might come up if you play like Small World perhaps. But those are the most played hand traps. And so moving on to the most played staples, there actually was a 3-way tie. We're just going to start with Cosmic Cyclone, which is a really strong card. Honestly, this card has been in my side deck for quite some formats now. And if you think about some of the top decks right now, you know, like Kashtira, where with like, let's say Rebirth, or even like the Field Spell, or let's say like Runick variants, you know, this is very key because something like Twin Twisters destroys and Hugin's going to protect that. So you need something like Cyclone that can banish. And then on top of that, you have, let's say, something like Branded Loss. You want to get rid of that. It's really problematic if you let that stick on board. And so Cosmic Cyclone, whether you go first or second, is very strong in this format, and I'm sure for a lot of formats. Against Labrynth, obviously any kind of Floodgate or like Skill Drain, right, you want to get rid of that, so it's really strong. The other tie was Dark Cooler, which is understandable. Has sort of come back in play now with like Spright coming back in more in terms of more like Runick variants. Against Kashtira, it can technically still have applicability too. I mean, while you can't free up your zones, at least they don't have like Mind Hacker anymore, so you're not getting zone 5 locked anyway, so it's still pretty decent. So I think, and it's like just a good generic going second card to have, especially when you're like, let's say, blind second because your opponent like scoop game on without showing what they're playing. Like, it's usually a safe bet to put this into. And then we talked about talents. This card is seeing a lot of play in this format. It's really good going first or second, especially in combination of something like Thrust. Makes it even more deadly because you can set whatever trap, or maybe even sometimes add whatever card to like at least like normal spell trap. So talent's really good. What can you really say? You know, you can draw, you can board break, you can punish your opponents for hand trapping you and getting rid of another card. Really strong, and in this format, I think it's pretty much always live when you're going second. And then we have Feather Duster, another backward removal, which of course, you know, no drawbacks to playing this card. You might as well play it, especially in a format where you have a lot of, you know, a strong trap deck in Labrynth. Of course, you're not going to be able to stop like a D-Barrier or Eradicator, but at the same time, it's still worth to have. And then we have Evenly Match, which is very strong still. You know, again, something like Kashtira, Labrynth, even Branded, it's really deadly if they did not have like Sanctifier set up, just to give you a monster so that you cannot evenly. And that's personally why I'm really sad about the ban of Expulsion, is that, you know, Expulsion really helped prevent Branded players from getting evenly too easily, and now we don't really have that, and we have to rely on Sanctifier. And the weird thing is, you know, Lightning Storm got semi-limited, but this was fine, even though this sort of banishes face down and Lightning Storm destroys. So there's other cards like, let's say, like, you know, Heavenly Prison or something, even like their Trap Tricks monsters that can like prevent destruction. So kind of puzzling to me that they allowed this to be at 3, but I guess I can't really complain for now. Speaking of Thrust, you know, this is very popular in combination with Tactics in particular. Usually if this is played, then Tactics is also played in conjunction with it. Really strong going first. At least something like a Pointer is banned now, but I do hope that they also ban something like, you know, D-Barrier as well as Eradicator. You know, just these normal traps where without Red Reboot, you just cannot really stop anymore. I mean, like, are you really playing Crossout just to be able to stop that card? So I do hope that those cards kind of disappear, especially now that, you know, Thrust is seeing so much play. And then we also have Book of Moon. This is kind of coming back in popularity. Originally, if you recall, when Kashtira was first, like, you know, the best deck, like Book of Eclipse, everyone was on that. And then I guess nowadays, especially if they're kind of doing more Rise Hard Pass, like Book of Moon is good enough, and it's very flexible going first or second. And then another tie at 13 is Call to the Grave. Not seeing as much play as it used to, but it's still obviously really good, especially going first. You really have to stop whatever hand trap. There's only one of it. I do not think this card should come back more than one. There's obviously a lot of debate. I just find that if it's at 3, it just helps tier 1 decks a lot more than it helps rogue decks, and that's why I believe that it should at the very least stay 1. If it gets banned, I would also understand that. And then we have Rise of Enemy Controller. This was also quite popular when Kashtira was kind of like emerging as the best deck initially. Really strong. It was even more popular back then because Ibli was quite popular, and you have to sort of get rid of it, and now you get the bonus of taking like your opponent's monsters. Ibli Lock is actually not that popular at all right now. In a way, to me, that was a little surprising with Branded doing so well the last format, and still doing pretty decent right now, and the deck just dies to Ibli, honestly. So Enemy Control, certainly a side option that you can consider. And then we have Anti-Spell Fragrance. This is another card that, for me personally, I've been saying for a while, I really hope would get banned. I just don't think it's healthy for the game because, you know, I just don't like things that just completely lock out a game mechanic, and I'm sure a lot of people feel that way. Not only does it completely stop the Pendulum mechanic, don't get me wrong, most people are not playing Pendulum stuff anyways, but, you know, the problem with Anti-Spell Fragrance right now is that if it was just this card, then sure, that's fine. It kind of slows things down, like whatever, you can play spells later. The problem is almost always this card is paired with like another Omni Negator too, and it just makes it almost impossible to break through, and it just makes, you know, these turn 1 boards even harder to break than they already are. So hopefully, I do think I'm pretty confident this card will get banned at some point in the future. And then we have some more staples in Dino Wrestler Pankratops. So it's kind of feeling like 2019-20 again. This card used to see pretty much play in almost every side deck. It is at 1. I should also mention, I should have also included Kashtira Fenrir in this analysis. And originally, when I was collecting the data, I decided not to put Fenrir because obviously in Kashtira, it's just like a main deck card. But I should have counted in non-Kashtira decks how many were playing Fenrir, because it's still a staple card. I'm pretty sure it was played at least at the same level of Pankratops. Really strong in terms of Pankratops. You know, you can pop back row, pop monsters, really versatile, and also a big booty to boot, and just attack over things. And then we have Lightning Storm, of course, recently got semi-limited. I mean, I guess, sure, kind of weird move, especially when Feather Duster is also still legal. But you know what, I guess it saw a decent amount of play. It's, again, pretty versatile card. You want to be able to get rid of all that back row or monsters, whatever. Really strong and certainly worth considering. And then we have Solemn Judgment. So this was actually seeing a pretty decent amount of side deck play. And this is another card, personally, I think it should actually just go back to like 1, which it actually, I believe it was around 4 years ago now, where it peeled off to 3. And I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, wow, this guy really hates trap decks. But keep in mind, Solemn Judgment is sided in a lot more than trap decks and even combo decks, right? And it makes going first boards way stronger than they really should. So I don't think it's really fair when this is at 3 and now there's no red reboot, so we just cannot stop Solemn Judgment. That's my opinion. Certainly open to your thoughts on it, but I think it's a little too strong. And then some other going second cards, Change of Heart. This was not seeing that much play lately. In tier format, it kind of became popular actually, but right now it's decent. I mean, it's honestly pretty strong. You saw that enemy controller is seeing more play now, so it makes sense that Change of Heart is kind of along in the same lines. And then lastly, we have Dark Hole, which, you know, kind of makes sense in terms of generic board wipe removal, you know, especially with like something like Vanquish Soul kind of coming in popularity, at least from right now. Monster removal cards like this is quite impactful, and you might as well play Dark Hole rather than Regeki for the most part, because let's say if you were to get like Ghibli locked, might as well get rid of that as well. So I think it's pretty understandable that something like Dark Hole is coming back in play. So that was it for the most played hand traps and staples in German and French Nats. Hopefully it's helpful in preparing your deck list for the upcoming remote YCS or whatever other regional event that you might have coming up. So big thanks to all of you for watching the video. Big thanks to my Patreons as usual for all of their continued support, and well, take care guys.